on September 11, 2001, I lost my son Mohammed Salman Hamdani at the World Trade Center. And with him, I lost all my dreams. I was stripped of all my identity and was left with the identity of a Muslim only. My son not only sacrificed, but was unfortunately speculated upon his actions of heroism that maybe he might have been linked with those terrorist attacks and because of his faith. And the Muslim Americans have become the next threatened race after the Jews on the path of genocide. I speak as a mother who searched for her son for 6 months before being confirmed about his death at the North Tower. I have experienced the agony and pain of searching for him and the hope that one day soon he will be coming home. The detainees at Guantanamo are not my Salman, but they are somebody's Salman. They are somewhere out there, a mother, a father, a child, a brother, a sister is awaiting for their safe return and news about them. And who is detaining them? The United States of America. We say we are not at war with Islam, yet actions do speak louder than words. Instead of repealing the egregious Patriot Act, this Congress has passed the National Defense Authorization Act, making legal and permanent the detention of American citizens indefinitely without any charge. Post 9/11 has seen the erosion of civil liberties, especially of Muslims, who have the same protection under our Constitution as Christians, Jews, Mormons, and people of all other faiths. Guantanamo is a shame, a disgrace for our nation, and we need to set the record straight by leading by example. As a nation, we have lost all moral standing in the world. Abu Ghraib, Fallujah, and Guantanamo testify how much we respect human rights and our own American core values of liberty and justice for all. Between the Patriot Act and the Guantanamo Bay, there are no boundaries of justice and fairness that we, as a supposedly law-abiding nation, have not violated. After 9/11, we embarked on a path of revenge and vendetta. A decade of wars and destruction has proven that this was the wrong cause. It is time we change course and give humanity a chance to redeem itself. We need to close Guantanamo, repeal the Patriot Act, and restore the rule of law and safeguard the civil liberties of all Americans, especially American Muslims, Arab Americans, South Asian Americans, and Pakistani Americans. We need to eliminate the clause in the National Defense Authorization Act on indefinite detention of Americans. We say no to it. Come on, say no to it. We say no to it. This is our America. The Pilgrims came to America to escape religious persecution, but 2 centuries later, we have metamorphosed into a society wrecked with racism and injustice. The American Muslims have carried the cross, 9/11 cross, for a decade, and we refuse to do so. The 3,000 Americans that died that day, they died for being American, and the first responders responded transcending the barriers of race, faith, and ethnicity. And that is what we need to do as a nation. It is time to reset the moral compass. We need to redeem the dignity of the land of the free and the home of the brave. President Obama, as you said a week ago, we have turned the page on a decade of war. President Obama, we call upon you. It is time to turn the page on a decade of indefinite detention and restore the rule of law. God bless you all. God bless America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Talat. We're going to invite now Colonel Morris Davis from the Crimes of War Education Project up to speak.
Well, thank you. And thank you for coming out on a day like this. It's unfortunate that more of your fellow citizens aren't here. I mean, I think in the minds of the public, Guantanamo is largely out of sight and out of mind, and they bought into the narrative that these guys are the worst of the worst, that whatever means are necessary to keep them safe, they're willing to accept. I was the chief prosecutor at Guantanamo for a little more than 2 years, and I believed at the time that we were committed to having full, fair, and open trials, and I resigned when I lost confidence, and that was our commitment. As I said, I joined the military and spent 25 years defending the Constitution because I believed in the Constitution. If you remember, in the Star-Spangled Banner, it says we're the land of the free and the home of the brave. But since 9/11, we've been the constrained and the cowardly. We need to restore American values. As a military member in 1991 during the first Gulf War, the Iraqis surrendered by the tens of thousands rather than fight because of our reputation, which is not to say we've been perfect, but we had a reputation for maintaining the high standard of humane treatment. I question today, 20 years later, whether those same Iraqi troops would put their guns down if they thought they were going to be tortured and sexually humiliated and detained indefinitely. Guantanamo has become a symbol that's contrary to American values. For 200 years, our strength was the rule of law. For the past decade, we've turned our back on the law. Guantanamo was thought to be a site that was outside the reach of the law. Unfortunately, President Obama said all the right things. Remember George Bush said, "Read my lips"? I read President Obama's lips, and he promised he was going to close Guantanamo. Congress, it's an election year, and it seems that you can't be too dumb or too hateful in this campaign season. So members of Congress have voted to make Guantanamo public. So Congress has failed us, the President has failed us. It's up to the people to demand that our government do the right thing and restore American values, and we begin that by closing Guantanamo.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? So, thank you all for coming. The U.S. military is out there today trying to tell the world that everything is okay at Guantanamo. That the world does not need to bother. It doesn't need to worry about what's happening in Guantanamo, that it's a normal state-of-the-art facility. So all of us have gathered here today, and in many cities the world over, to answer with a resounding no, to remind the President, to remind Congress, to remind the military that Guantanamo is every bit as unacceptable today as it was a decade ago when it was open. And I want to share with you what my clients at Guantanamo said when they heard that we would assemble in Washington on this anniversary. They want to thank each and every one of you for standing here in solidarity with them and with their families. And they also want you all to know that on this day, they too, at Guantanamo, are staging a peaceful protest of their own. That as we stand here today, every single cell block at Guantanamo is engaging in a peaceful sit-in with banners and signs. The prisoners are refusing to return to their cell blocks. They are refusing food as part of a 3-day hunger strike. And they wanted to do this in solidarity with all of you here today, and to send a message to the world, a clear message, that to the men at Guantanamo, as for us here today, Guantanamo remains unacceptable. Now, it's also very important for all of us to remember that Guantanamo is unfortunately no longer just a single detention site. Guantanamo has now become an idea, it has become an ideology that every single one of us must resist wherever we find it. We must remember every Guantanamo-like dimension of this never-ending war on terror. We cannot forget Guantanamo's less known and larger evil twin in Afghanistan, the U.S. military prison at Bagram Air Base, and like my client Amin al-Bakri, have been held for nearly a decade without fair process. We cannot forget the Muslim majority communications management units in federal prisons in the United States. We cannot forget the cruel special administrative measures, which are harsh conditions imposed mostly on Muslim pretrial detainees and convicts in federal terrorism trials across the United States. We must not forget the predatory prosecutions and investigations that the FBI and local agencies like the NYPD use to target Muslim communities across the United States. And we certainly should not forget the National Defense Authorization Act that President Obama signed into law on New Year's Eve, that entrenches Guantanamo's legacy in the American way of life, and that furthers the militarization of our justice system. So, we're all here to remind the powerful that we see what's happening across the board, that they aren't the only ones with a bird's eye view, and that we're not dupes. We know what they are doing, and we will not stand by silently as our government destroys people's lives in our names. And to remind them also that we will remember the promises that our elected representatives forgot. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramzi. Our next speaker is Martha Rayner. She's a professor at Fordham in New York City, and she and her students have been representing men at Guantanamo for the last 6 years. So welcome Martha up now.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. It means a lot to the clients we represent. This statement is made by over 100 lawyers who have represented or currently represent men imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay in federal habeas corpus proceedings. We are solo practitioners. We are partners and associates in law firms. We're federal public defenders. We're former prosecutors, law professors, and human rights activists who practice in nearly every area of law. We hail from nearly every state in the Union. We stand here together on this, the 10th anniversary of the opening of the prison at Guantanamo, to call on our government to provide meaningful justice for the 171 men who are still held there. 10 years ago, the first men and boys were shipped secretly from different parts of the world to Guantanamo, and ultimately the number grew to nearly 800. The government called these individuals, quote, enemy combatants, a term without legal meaning in order to evade established rules of international law to impose indefinite imprisonment without any legal process whatsoever, and to employ unlawful interrogation techniques and even torture. Our government tried to make the prison camp a legal black hole, where the sanitizing light of due process and the rule of law would not penetrate. It said that all the Guantanamo prisoners were, quote, terrorists, and even, quote, the worst of the worst, in order to justify this unjust incarceration. As attorneys for the prisoners, we have worked hard to show that these government claims are wrong. We have litigated dozens of cases, filed thousands of legal briefs. We have fought all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court 3 times so far to establish that these men cannot be indefinitely detained without due process of law, and that this prison is not outside the law. We continue to fight for these fundamental principles enshrined by the U.S. Constitution and international human rights law. These same principles animate our demands now. Every one of the 171 men remaining at Guantanamo deserves the due process of law. First, every one whom the government still holds captive should be charged criminally and provided a fair trial or released. The Constitution, as well as international human rights law, require no less. And second, over half of these men were cleared for repatriation or resettled to their home countries some years ago. They should be repatriated or resettled promptly. No law, no logic can allow a government to continue to imprison individuals whom that government has said pose no threat. We have shown why these men are not the worst of the worst. In court filings and in news articles, the evidence shows that many of them were sold for bounties or falsely accused by those who were being tortured, or simply captured in the fog of war because they were at the wrong place at the wrong time. In fact, that 600 of the nearly 800 men once imprisoned at Guantanamo were unilaterally released by the government proves that their rhetoric was false. It was base fear-mongering. In any case, the important point is a court should determine each man's guilt or innocence after a fair criminal trial. And a decade is too long to wait. We have learned and wish to remind the world of the human dignity of our clients, based on countless hours we have spent in conversation with them. They are not nameless, faceless, quote, terrorists. They are fathers, they are brothers, they are sons to family members who have not seen them in a decade. And they feel the deepest pain from the missing their loved ones back home. They have endured an unthinkable ordeal, including, in a great many cases, torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. They have also endured prolonged isolation and other brutal conditions of imprisonment, causing them to deteriorate physically and psychologically. They face the most profound uncertainty about their futures and experience the daily grinding weight of the hopelessness that pervades Guantanamo. Yet, they manage to preserve their humanity and dignity against all odds in the most surprising and inspiring ways. We ask the world to remember our clients on this day and the remaining days of their imprisonment. As Americans, we know that the rule of law is one of the greatest accomplishments of our nation. We call on the government to respect the rule of law and end the disastrous and shameful legacy of Guantanamo Bay. And we call on President Obama and our government to promptly repatriate or resettle the prisoners who have already been approved for release, and to provide prompt and fair trials, criminal trials, to those whom the government still holds. Our fundamental constitutional principles requires no less. 10 years is too long. We hope that this 10th anniversary of the Guantanamo Bay prison will be its last. Thank you.
The religious community knows very well the power of symbols. Religious symbols motivate people to do good and even courageous acts. Some religions see God in the symbol itself, amplifying its power to motivate. Symbols can also be destructive. They can confuse as well as foster dangerous behavior. Because it is a symbol of the U.S. torture policies, the detention center at Guantanamo is profoundly destructive. Guantanamo is the symbol of our country's violations of our deepest values. Regardless of how it operated now compared to how it operated in earlier years, it still stands in the minds of hundreds of millions of people in our nation and around the globe as the place where America broke faith with itself and used torture as an interrogation technique. Torture is immoral, it's illegal, and it's never justifiable without exception. Guantanamo is a symbol of our nation's vulnerability to abandon our principles and commitment to the rule of law in times of crisis. It is a stain on our image and our reputation. It weakens our moral authority and influence around the world. And it puts our troops and our citizens abroad in danger. Recently, the 3 American hikers imprisoned in Iran, the confinement which the U.S. government condemned, reported that their captors used Guantanamo as justification for their imprisonment and abuse. Although President Obama banned torture shortly after taking office in 2009 and pledged to close Guantanamo, it remains open. Congress has passed legislation that impedes the closing of this detention center. Recently, we have seen candidates for president still advocate torture as a legitimate means of interrogation, at times prompting applause from their supporters. The continued operation of the detention camp at Guantanamo raises the worrying prospect that this legacy of government-approved torture may leave the U.S. more susceptible to a return to torture policies in administrations after Obama's. The challenge for the United States is to ensure that U.S.-sponsored torture never happens again. I think about that goal a lot. I do not want my 8 grandchildren to grow up in a country that engages in torture. I want them to be able to say in their adulthood that there was a dark and sad chapter of U.S. history when torture took place, but that's over now. That won't happen again. That's what I covered for them. My grandchildren will only grow up in a torture-free world if the most contemporary, powerful symbol of torture is dismantled. Our nation must close the detention center at Guantanamo Bay now to remove a dangerous symbol and to ensure that the next generations do not grow up in a country that tortures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming out on such a miserable and cold day. To mark the 10th anniversary of the arrival of the first prisoners at Guantanamo, Amnesty International released a report this month entitled Guantanamo, A Decade of Damage of Human Rights. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that, because Guantanamo is much more than simply the sum of its parts. It actually sends out 10 very powerful anti-human rights messages to the world. The first is that the world is a battleground in a global war in which human rights don't apply. Some of the inmates at Guantanamo have come from thousands of miles away from any active conflict area. Mauritania, Bosnia, Kenya, Iran, yeah, even Iran handed over 2 of the individuals currently detained in Guantanamo. That's message number 1. Message number 2 is that humane detainee treatment is a policy choice, not a legal requirement. By ignoring long-established detainee treatment standards at a time of national emergency, the United States has given authoritarian states around the world the political cover to do the same. In doing so, the United States has not acted so much as the shining city on the hill, but rather more as the little shop of horrors. Human rights message number 3, or anti-human rights message number 3. Even detentions found unlawful by courts can continue indefinitely. In 2010, a federal court judge in the United States ordered the release of Guantanamo detainee Mohamedou Ould Salahi, noting, a habeas court may not permit a man to be held indefinitely on suspicion or because the government makes a prediction he may do something unlawful in the future. That was 2 years ago. At the time of the hearing, he'd already been imprisoned in Guantanamo for 8 years. He's still there today. Anti-human rights message number 4. The right to a fair trial depends on where you come from. At the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the US government started to craft a counterterrorism approach that drew a clear distinction between US citizens and everybody else. That has been cemented by the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act, which treats foreigners differently from US persons. Equality before the law is the most fundamental principle of justice. Anti-human rights message number 5. Justice can be manipulated to ensure the government always wins. Like the Bush administration, Team Obama keeps its hand firmly on its side of the scales of justice. Great quote from Congressman Jerry Nadler as chair of the House Committee on the Subcommittee on the Constitution, summing up the legal system we now have. Those who we have good evidence against will get fair trials. Those we have weak evidence against will get less fair trials. And those we have no evidence against will just keep them locked up in a preventative detention cell. Anti-human rights message number 6. Execution is acceptable, even after an unfair trial. Today, 139 countries around the world have either abolished executions in practice or in law. Fair trial guarantees, at a very bare minimum, have to be in place if you're going to bring somebody up on a capital trial. Military commissions do not meet that fair trial standard. They do not meet Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention that requires the trial of military detainees in a regularly constituted court that applies the judicial guarantees, all the judicial guarantees recognized as indispensable by civilized peoples. The military commissions do not do that. Having the death penalty at military commissions is unconscionable. Anti-human rights message number 7. victims of human rights violations can be left without remedy. A right to an effective remedy is recognized in all international and regional human rights treaties, all of them, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that the United States ratified in 1992. Yet, just like the Bush administration, the Obama administration blocks access for justice for former detainees and former torture victims, even at the same time that other countries like Canada and the United States Canada and the United Kingdom have provided millions of dollars in compensation to people abused at the behest of the United States of America. It can be done, it should be done. Anti-human rights message number 8, looking forward means turning a blind eye to truth and accountability. In November, President Obama restated his belief that waterboarding is torture after aspirant Republican candidates in one of the endless debates came out on stage and said they would reinstate enhanced interrogation techniques. Well, torture is a serious domestic and international criminal offense. It is a war crime. To paraphrase Lindsey Graham, it is not knocking over the corner liquor store. This is a serious, serious business. We have not held one person responsible for putting in place the policies that led to the torture of individuals at Guantanamo Bay, Bagram, and other places to account. We hold foreign leaders to a higher standard than we hold our own. Anti-human rights message number 9. Request for human rights comes second. Respect for human rights comes second to local values. Cultural relativism has long been a convenient excuse for authoritarian regimes resisting the application of international human rights standards. The problem with citing local values as one's moral compass is that these are contested. Everybody disagrees about what they are. We have the law, let's follow it. Finally, number 10, anti-human rights message number 10. Double standards, not universal standards, apply. In 2003, President Bush issued a statement to mark United Nations International Day in support of the victims of torture. And he described in that freedom from torture as an inalienable human right. He proclaimed that torture anywhere was a threat to human dignity everywhere. And he asserted, and this is my favorite, that the United States is committed to the worldwide elimination of torture, and with nary a smile on his face, said he was leading the fight by example. This was just a few weeks after Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded in a program that President Bush authorized. At least 12 of the 171 men still held at Guantanamo arrived on that first flight. Only one of them has been convicted of offense. The other 11 haven't had an opportunity to defend themselves in a court of law. In his memoir, Decision Points, President Bush recalled in his second inauguration address that he had realized that Guantanamo was a recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda and a distraction for our allies. That is every bit as true today as it was 10 years ago today, when the first prisoners arrived in Cuba. But Guantanamo is even more dangerous. It's a symbol that emboldens predatory states to ignore fundamental human rights. Those rights exist to protect the powerless from the powerful, and we are all less secure as long as Guantanamo remains open. Thank you very much.
ho! Guantanamo has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Guantanamo has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Guantanamo has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Guantanamo has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Guantanamo has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Guantanamo has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Guantanamo has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Guantanamo has got to go!
much. I've never been here on the Hill before, so this is quite an amazing experience for me to be here. Hello everybody, I just want to say how amazing it is to see so many young people here. It really is. One of the things that seems to have happened over the last year or so has been this awakening of people's interest and understanding of what's wrong with the world. It's absolutely brilliant to see so many young people here. So, here we are on this terrible anniversary. It really is an absolute disgrace that we have to be here, that it is 10 years today that the first prisoners arrived at Guantanamo. And where we are with these great institutions is very significant today as well, because these are places that have failed, that are responsible for part of the failure of what's happened. And we actually passed a very interesting building on the way here. We're standing in front of the Supreme Court. We passed where the DC Circuit Court is. And those are the judges at the moment that are holding the decisions about detainee policy in their hands. These are the people who have gutted habeas corpus of all meaning when it comes to the Guantanamo prisoners. And we need to be asking these people behind us to take on some of the cases that are making its way towards them, to say it's up to you to decide how to close Guantanamo, how to restore meaning to habeas corpus. This is the Great Writ. It's nearly 800 years old, when the barons of England forced King John to sign Magna Carta in 1215. So we're 3 years away from its 800th anniversary. The right not to be held in arbitrary indefinite detention by anybody, by the monarch it was initially, but the right not to be held without having had a fair trial. And we're looking at that position that the men in Guantanamo are still in. These are men who are all stuck facing indefinite detention without charge or trial, unless we can find a way to make that change in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Now I will introduce Tom Wilner. He's one of the very first lawyers good enough to represent men detained at Guantanamo. He's a real hero of our movement. We'll hear from him now.
Well, thank you. Believe me, I'm not a hero. It's an honor to be able to be with you here today. I did work originally on the Supreme Court cases to assure that the Supreme Court ruled in 2004 that the detainees had the right to habeas corpus, the right to a fair hearing.
Louder, please.
Excuse me. The Supreme Court ruled in 2004 that the detainees at Guantanamo had the right to habeas corpus, to a fair hearing. Congress revoked that right, and with Steve Valesky, who's here, we then won the case in 2008, say they had the constitutional right to a fair hearing. As Andy said, why am I not doing this right?
One step back and
one step to your left.
Okay, normally I can speak without a microphone. The microphone screws it up. In any event, as Andy said, the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia has gutted that decision. They opposed the decision by the Supreme Court granting habeas corpus, and the Court of Appeals has now gutted it. I hope that this court will again take review to restore the right of habeas corpus to these people down here. Let me say another thing. I fought this fight for habeas corpus and for fairness for the people down there because I believe in America. And I believe it's in American principles. We're not here some radical left-wing people. We're really pushing for American values. I hate to quote him again, but Ronald Reagan said that our greatest strength in the world is not our wealth or our power, but our ideals. Our ideals of freedom and justice and the rule of law. Guantanamo violates those ideals. It hurts us every day it remains open, and it should be closed immediately.
How's that? Better? Better? Okay. I'm next going to reintroduce Vince Warren, the Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, truly heroes of our movement, the legal collective that filed the first habeas petitions on behalf of the detainees just days after the first ones were brought to Guantanamo, a point in which the Bush administration said we weren't even entitled to know their names out of concern for the safety of their families. This, of course, was hogwash. Center for Constitutional Rights has for years now led the effort to get basic human and constitutional rights delivered to these detainees.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Center for Constitutional Rights, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out and supporting this amazing, amazing effort. These kinds of battles for social change, to right the wrongs and to correct the path that this government has gone on, doesn't just happen in the courts. The courts are an important part of it, but it also happens in the streets. It's the people like you that come out, that are sacrificing and thinking of the men that are in detention as you are out here, as we're out here on this cold and rainy day. This is what change is about. This is why we sent this message to President Obama. This is why we're sending the message to the Congress, and this is why we're sending the message to the Supreme Court. It makes sense for us to think 10 long years after this Guantanamo Bay was opened, how did we actually get here and where are we going? One thing that we know, and Tom has talked about the incredible legal battles that have been going on, the center has been very proud to be a part of that. But we also have to look at where have we come. And we're in a country now that has completely confused the idea of criminal prosecution and military detention. It's gotten so bizarre that we've actually have an intelligence director that's a former general, and we have a military director that's a former intelligence officer. That's where we are in this country right now. We've also merged the functions that have been held dear for such a long period of time. The law enforcement function and the military function have been merged. They used to be separate. When we see the passage of the NDAA, where there is even a debate or a discussion as to whether people here in the United States who get picked up on criminal charges can be held in indefinite detention at the whim of the president and being put in military commissions, that is not a democracy. A democracy dies when we give the president the choice of whether to charge us militarily or charge us criminally. That is the path that we're on. I'm so happy that you all are out here. This is a big, deep battle. It goes to Guantanamo, but it also goes beyond Guantanamo. This matters to all of us. So I want to thank you all very much for coming out.
Thank you so much, Vince. Let me say briefly that I'm from Witness Against Torture. The Supreme Court grounds are deeply important to us. In 2007, on a day like this, January 11th, rainy, 80 of us were arrested at the Supreme Court. 40 inside, 40 outside. The Supreme Court was briefly shut down. We didn't have the language yet, but we occupied the Supreme Court. Many of us took as names men detained at Guantanamo and gave the police the name of the Guantanamo detainee in lieu of their own name. About 30 stood trial on behalf of Guantanamo prisoners, prefacing everything they said by saying, I'm an American citizen here on behalf of, and then listed the name of the detainee. It's wonderful to be back here. There's an important case about habeas that may come here, which is, in a sense, the final moment for the court to act, to uphold the spirit and the letter of its earlier decision. We'll hear more about that very shortly. Now I'd like to introduce Deborah Sweet from World Can't Wait. They have done tremendous organizing work, and in particular bringing this message and these messages to the grassroots, organizing in communities around the country. Welcome, Deborah Sweet.
What's up? You know why you are all so beautiful? You Guantanamo attorneys, you occupiers, you people who led us in orange jumpsuits, because you are maladjusted to injustice. Maladjusted to injustice. This is what we need in this country. We're all asking today, after 10 frigging years, why has it taken so long to get to this point even? Where we're looking at, across the globe, a United States government spreading indefinite detention, spreading targeted assassination, the proposed indefinite detention of people across the world, not only in black sites, but 2,000 of our brothers in Bagram right now being held by the authority of the United States without habeas rights. And why? Says the Obama administration, because they're in a war zone. You can't have the right to no charges against you, to have legal defense, to know how you're going to get out, because you're in a war zone. And why can't you get out of Guantanamo? because it has been a remarkably effective prison in intimidating and terrorizing whole countries across the globe. We who are maladjusted to injustice, we who care about humanity and the planet, have just signed up. Whether it takes another year, months, or another decade, we are going to be here in this struggle to stop the crimes of our government. And I'd like you all to take out your smartphones, your pens, write down closeguantanamo.org. Sign up right now, because if you do that, you're going to get the stories of the Guantanamo prisoners sent to you every week. And you're going to be able to share those with people in your schools, your churches, in your occupations. You're going to be able to bring this tremendous need, and you're going to be able to bring the humanity of our brothers being held to all of us, which is what we're doing today. Thank you for being here. The world can't wait.
Now we have a very, very special guest. His name is Daniel Lackmeyer. He served in the United States Navy and spent 7 long months at Guantanamo. He was so morally repelled by what his government was asking him and the other staff and guards to do that he filed for and was granted conscientious objector status.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak for just a minute. Today has been one of the most moving days that I've had since returning from Gitmo, because down there I saw men in orange jumpsuits every day, and it was a place filled with hatred, a place filled with terror for people on both sides. And yet today, there was a level of personalization and humanization that was completely absent in Guantanamo Bay. The reason that that place can continue to work is because when I was there, we didn't know people by names. We didn't see them as people. We were taught and ingrained in us not to. They had numbers, or they even, if numbers became too personal, then you referred to them by the cell that they were in. And sometimes they changed cells, so then the face wasn't even associated with anything. Constantly changing, constantly dehumanizing the people that were there. Today what you've done, you've put a face. I see people's faces, faces that I saw when I was there. I see people called out by name, appreciated as individuals, recognized as members of families. Thank you for coming out here today. This is far and away the most people I've ever seen care about the men that are down there as people. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 more brief speakers. The first is Steve Oleski. He was the attorney for a former detainee named Boumediene, and the case that he worked on became the famous Boumediene case, in which the Supreme Court granted habeas rights, now threatened, but nonetheless granted in 2007, I believe, habeas rights to Guantanamo detainees.
This is a great day for all the habeas lawyers, and there are hundreds of them around the country, because you've shown us that you, the citizens, are there and not just we, the lawyers, and that's really critical. I've been to Guantanamo about 25 times to see my clients. 5 have been released because of the Supreme Court decision in 2008 that was just mentioned. If you haven't had a chance to read the Sunday New York Times op-ed by Mr. Boumediene, the lead plaintiff, go back and read it. It's a very moving account of how his life was destroyed for 8 years in Guantanamo, but how he courageously is reconstructing it now. What I'll take back to Guantanamo on my next trip to our last client, Ben Saya Belkacem, who will be there 10 years on January 20th, is an answer to the question he always asks me, which is, does anybody care? Does anybody notice what's happening to us? Why am I still here when so many others have gone? Why don't your courts speak out? Why doesn't your Congress speak out? This is all very confusing. I don't understand how this could happen. And believe me, it's almost impossible to explain it to him, and I've been in this case since 2004. What I can take back to him now is the passion and commitment of all of you, and that means hope for him, and that's something tangible and meaningful So I want to say on behalf of him and the other men in Guantanamo, thank you so much for coming out today in this cold rain and showing that you care. Now let's multiply your passion from here around the country. Join peace groups in your own community, speak out on this issue, and be there for the men in Guantanamo who have no other advocates. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, finally we're going to hear from Layli Kashani, who's the Education and Outreach Director at the Center for Constitutional Rights, one of the main forces behind organizing this day, a prior event at the National Press Club in which a number of people addressed the media, and she's been working diligently on this issue for many, many years. She's going to say a bit about the Latif case that could go to the Supreme Court, and then conclude by reading a poem of a Guantanamo detainee in call and response fashion, and then we will end our program.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's wonderful to see you all here. I'm turning around and I'm looking at the Supreme Court of our land, or of the United States, and it says equal justice under law. There is no equal justice under law. Guantanamo Bay is a prison that was created after the fact that imprisons Muslim and Arab men exclusively. These men do not have equal justice under the law, and the men in the United States domestically who are faced with terrorism detentions and prosecutions also don't have equal justice under the law. And today I'm thinking of Jamal Amazian. He is represented by the Center for Constitutional Rights. I've spent most of my days for at least the last 2 years thinking of this man. I want to tell you just a couple of words about him before closing. Jamal Amazian is an Algerian. He's in his 40s. I've seen his pictures over the years. He's been aging at Guantanamo. He's been held now for 10 years without charge or trial. He's unjustly held. He should never have been there. It's extremely clear that this is a man who should never have been in Guantanamo. The government itself acknowledges that he has never committed any act of violence. He himself has said he has never, ever picked up anything except a pen and a paintbrush. He paints, and I hope soon in New York and perhaps across this country we can show the work that he's been doing, the paintings that he's been doing at Guantanamo, shreds of his humanity that we can see, that we now have access to. So he must be set free. He must be resettled. He's afraid of going back to Algeria, where he fled during the violence there. He went to Afghanistan. He was kicked out of Austria. There was a right-wing government that came in '95 and didn't renew his visa. He ended up in Canada, and he's a French speaker. And then he was denied asylum there, and he was desperate, and he didn't want to go back to Algeria. He was very much afraid, and he ended up in Afghanistan. The American bombs started falling during the war. He fled towards the borders, and he was picked up and sold for a bounty to the U.S. Army. That's why he's in Guantanamo. This must end. And shame, indeed shame. And it will mean so much to him that we'll be able to tell him that all of you were here, that he's been remembered, that his photograph is visible, and that you all here are committed to making sure that him and all those who've been unjustly detained are freed. And I've been given this poem to close with. It's by Osama Hassan Abu Kabir. He was a Jordanian man detained at Guantanamo until 2007, and when I read his words, and hopefully you can read them with me, I think of Jamal Amazian because these words ring true to him as well. So we can try to do this open mic style and see how this goes. So, is it true?
Is it true?
Is it true that the grass grows again after rain?
Is it true that the grass grows again after rain?
Is it true that the flowers will rise up in the spring?
Is it true that the flowers will rise up in the spring?
Is it true that birds will migrate home again?
Is it true that birds will migrate home again?
Is it true that the salmon swim back up their stream?
Is it true that the salmon swim back up their stream?
Is it true?
Is it true?
This is true.
This is true.
These are all miracles.
These are all miracles.
But is it true that one day we'll leave Guantanamo Bay?
But is it true that one day we'll leave Guantanamo Bay?
Is it true that one day we'll go back to our homes?
Is it true that one day we'll go back to our homes?
I sail in my dreams.
I sail in my dreams.
I am dreaming of home.
I am dreaming of home.
To be with my children.
To be with my children.
Each one part of me.
Each one part of me.
To be with my wife and the ones that I love.
To be with my wife and the ones that I love.
To be with my parents.
To be with my parents.
My world's tenderest hearts.
My world's tenderest hearts.
I dream to be home, to be free from this cage.
I dream to be home, to be free from this cage.
But do you hear me, O Judge?
But do you hear me, O Judge?
Do you hear me at all?
Do you hear me at all?
We are innocent.
We are innocent.
We've committed no crime.
We've committed no crime.
Set me free.
Set me free.
Set us free.
Set us free.
If anywhere still.
If anywhere still.
Justice and compassion remain in this world.
Justice and compassion remain in this world.
On this 10th anniversary, I trust that that none of us here will forget these words.
That none of us here will forget these words.
I trust that none of us will forget Jamal Amezian.
I trust that none of us will forget Jamal Amezian.
And I trust that none of us will stop fighting.
And I trust that none of us will stop fighting.
To shut down Guantanamo.
To shut down Guantanamo.
And all unjust detentions.
And all unjust detentions.
Until the last man is free.
Until the last man is free.
All men at Guantanamo and all boys, but until the last man and woman is free indeed in unjust detentions. And until the torture and abuses which they have suffered.
Tortures and abuses which they have suffered.
And that there's accountability for such abuses.
And that there's accountability for such abuses.
Thank you all, and onwards.
Thank you.